Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to just run through some talking points on some of the new lens and camera announcements that have come out of the WPPI conference that's taking place right now. And when I put a poll out there, if you were interested in me making a video to talk about my reaction to some of these things, the response was pretty overwhelmingly yes. And so here I am. One of the interesting things about doing what I do is that often I'll get press releases, in advance of actual announcements of lenses, and I'm, of course, there's an NDA, I'm not allowed to talk about them. And so as a result, I have to listen to people, kick around the rumors and often get things wrong. Not always, but in many cases, the details aren't quite right. And so it can be interesting to sit back and just kind of bite your tongue as people, go on at length about things that they're kind of guessing at in some ways. But there are some things that have really stood out to me about a huge amount of releases that have taken place. And I want to highlight some of the things that I think really signal some changes in our industry right now that are really interesting to me, that kind of stood out more than just the announcement of cameras and lenses. That's not unusual, but there's some shifts here that are taking place. First on, let's talk about Sony for a few minutes, because in some ways, I feel that with the a7R III and now with the a7 III, that Sony may have officially arrived as a contender. Sony has been somewhat of a bit player when it comes to kind of actually taking some of the DSLR market. And while they've been successful with their mirrorless cameras, it's not been so much a big movement from Canon and Nikon shooters to Sony, at least on a permanent basis, because there was just too many compromises there on the Sony base, either in the ergonomics or the battery life or in the lens selection. But we've seen a shift on all of that. For one, with the a7R Mark III, we saw Sony release a more fully realized, complete camera than what they ever had previously. And now with the a7 III, we see a camera that is just loaded with features at a price point of right under $2,000 that is going to make it really intriguing, say to a Canon shooter that's considering the 6D Mark II and looking at the feature list of the a7 Mark III and realizing, wow, there's a lot of bang for buck in that camera, and there certainly is. But I think also that Sony is maybe playing a little bit of a risky game here, in that while I think that they certainly will gain some that are considering moving from Canon or Nikon to Sony because of that, they also risk really cannibalizing the sales, number one, of the a7R Mark III, which has really only been out for a few months. And so, there are a lot of early adopters that, or those that hadn't yet bought an a7R Mark III, that now all of a sudden are going to say, how much do I really need 42 megapixels? And obviously there are a few other features beyond that the a7R Mark III has, that the a7 III doesn't. But for those that are, more maybe video oriented, they're going to look at the a7 III and say, hey, that's got everything that I need. And of course, since it pretty much matches the, the frame rate and burst and buffer of the a7R Mark III, at least in theory, then it means also that there are people that, that once again are saying, I shoot more action, or I shoot sports, and I don't need a huge amount of megapixels, and I certainly don't want to spend twice as much to get the a9. And that's the other thing. I mean, other than the people that are, hardcore need close to 20 frames per second, which frankly is a really small percentage of shooters, who's going to be buying the a9 at this point with the options of the a7R Mark III and now the a7 III that kind of go after two different demographics there, that both of which could have been overlapped with the a9. And so anyway, I think that Sony is looking at a very high risk and reward type situation here. Bottom line, though, is that as consumers, we now have another very compelling option to consider in the a7 III. Now, another thing I think that is huge for Sony's arrival, that in my opinion is even bigger than the a7 III, is the announcement of all kinds of autofocusing third-party lenses for a Sony FE, including a big lineup of 7 lenses from Sigma, which I'll highlight more on that in just a second. But Sigma is basically retrofitting a number of the existing Art Series lenses for Sony FE, and then with 2 newly announced lenses that we'll talk a little bit more about in a second, making those also natively FE compatible. And so all of a sudden you have a number of new prime options at Sony art price points, which are more reasonable than comparative Sony lenses. Then Tokina announced a 20mm F2 of Ferren Lens, which I look at that as a very, very interesting lens. In fact, I've asked Tamron in conversations with them to basically make that lens a 20mm F2, not such a wide aperture like Sigma's, that it requires it to be big and bulky and no front filters. But for those of us that are interested in a more portable lens, where we're making less compromises, because frankly in a lot of situations I don't necessarily need f1.4 so much at a 20mm focal length. And so anyway, I'm very interested in looking at that lens. Also, Tamron announced a 28 to 75mm f2.8 lens. The huge thing about that is that it helps to fill that gap between Sony's somewhat lackluster variable aperture 28 to 75mm, and then of course the hugely expensive 24 to 70mm f2.8 G Master lens. And so now somewhere there in the middle, and the price point has not yet been announced, but I'm assuming it's going to be optically solid. Tamron's been producing really good lenses. Feature-wise and build, I have no doubt that it's going to be good. We'll see how they do with autofocus on FE, but this is a dedicated FE only lens. And certainly one that fills a gap, and so gives some affordable options. That's one of the big issues that has held Sony back, because a lot of people say, well, the glass, there's not too many options and they're mostly expensive. And very often Sony's lenses, if you compare them across with the Canon and the Nikon alternatives, they are the most expensive. And so that's huge there as well. And so to me, this really helps to solve one of the major problems for Sony. And for us as consumers, it gives third-party, less expensive options that are very optically good. It also, I think, maybe can create some pressure on Sony to be a little bit more reasonable in some of its price point and future releases, and maybe even existing lenses. And so we'll see how that affects. But I have to believe that both Tamron and Sigma have exerted some pressure on Canon and Nikon due to just making awesome lenses that are optically similar or even better in some cases at less expensive price points. Now, looking at Sigma again for a moment, they're jumping into FE with both feet. And I'm going to give you kind of a half glass full and half glass empty approach. The positives here is that I have personally seen better focus results, even using the Sigma MC11 adapter on the A7R Mark III, than what I have ever gotten out of Sigma Art Series lenses before. And the promise is from Sigma is that in each one of these cases that the focus algorithms are going to be tuned to the individual lens, which you can't do with an adapter, and thus autofocus results should be even better. Plus they're saying that more features are going to be enabled, including the profile being preloaded into the lens, and so that you can account for aberrations and all of those things in camera, which is certainly a plus for on Sony systems. And so, I mean, all of those things are a positive. And of course, all of a sudden we have 5 new options, plus potentially 2 more that are coming somewhere across the year, with the promise of a retrofit going across pretty much the Sony range. And so one lens, for example, that I would be very interested in seeing that happen with, say, would be the new 50mm f4 sport lens. There really isn't a whole lot going on for Sony in the telephoto end. And so that would be huge. And of course, something like the 150 to 600mm sport lens, sure, it dwarfs the camera, but it already dwarfed the DSLRs that you attach it to. And so, I mean, it doesn't really make that huge of a difference, but it would enable you to have, better focusing, faster focusing, more fully featured options out there. So that could be huge. The negative is that if you're looking at mirrorless from the advantage of being smaller and lighter, all of these Art Series lenses that are getting this FE retrofit, they're not going to be any smaller than their DSLR companion comparisons, but in fact they're going to be a little bit bigger, because essentially what Sigma is doing is building in a kind of a custom adapter right into the lens mount. And so what we are seeing is that instead of the lens being more compact for mirrorless, it's actually going to probably be 1.25 1.5 inches longer, and of course some extra weight due to the adapter necessary there. And so, byproduct is that, Sigma art lenses were already large to begin with, heavy to begin with, and they're going to get even more so, which means that balance may not be fantastic. So the negative here is that these are not native lenses designed from the ground up for Sony FE. And so as a result, you're not going to see any kind of size weight advantage compared to the counterparts. And what I'm interested in seeing is that I've had a pretty good experience with the Sigma MC11 on a number of these lenses. And so for someone like me, if I'm looking at the possibility of shooting a lens on both systems, say a Canon or Nikon and Sony, well, of course, if I'm going from Canon to Sony, it means that I could shoot that lens on both a Canon and then with the MC11 shoot it on Sony, which works pretty well. And so are they going to be that much better to where it would be worth having a lens that works only on FE as opposed to having that versatility? And so, we'll have to see how that all compares out, and I plan on actually doing those comparisons and reporting back to you about that. Now, moving on to some of the other news about Canon and Nikon. Obviously, a big thing for Canon is the announcement of the M50, a mirrorless body that finally has 4K video. And, positive is it's at a decent codec. Negative is that frame rate is capped at 24 or 25 frames per second. And so, I think most of us would prefer to see a 30 frame per second option. But this is huge because Canon is announcing this camera at a price point of $799, fully articulating screen. And so it's really going to put some pressure, I think, on, for example, I'm filming on a Sony a6500 right now, which while I suspect it will still have some feature advantages over this M50 from Canon, the fact that the M50 will have 4K video and a fully articulating screen are two things going to make a lot of people say, And the fact that it's going to undercut the A6500 by $500-600 in price is also going to make people really consider. So this is a camera I think that is going to get Canon some attention and hopefully announces Canon's intent to really get serious in the mirrorless market. Tamron also announced a 70 to 210 millimeter SP series F4 lens with their VC in it. This is, I think, going to be a pretty good seller for them. For one thing, it's coming to market at a price of under $800 US. It has all of Tamron's kind of modern, features, which are really fantastic. Plus, of course, it's got that extra 10 millimeters of reach over the competing lenses from Canon or Nikon. And so I think that that's a lens that's going to do well for them and should be very interesting for those that don't want the extra weight and size and price of an f2.8 lens. Of course, Sigma also has announced a couple of new lenses, including a 70mm f2.8 macro lens that is going to be sold across the range, Canon, Nikon, Sigma, but also Sony FE. Also, they are announcing a 105mm f1.4 Art Series lens. So on that quickly, the 70mm is going to be the first macro lens that actually gets the Art Series designation. One thing that's interesting is this, the press release does say that this will have, moisture and dust resistance, and so that will be a plus, something that's not previously been available on these macro type lenses. I'm interested in seeing how I like a 70mm focal length here. This is a full frame lens. It's a DG designation for Sigma, and so it's maybe slightly an oddball focal length for me. I'll see how it plays out in real life, but I'm certainly interested in looking at that lens. And then of course the 105mm f1.4 could be a very serious player. Now this is, you can tell by looking at the photos and the press release here, this is going to be a big lens. And its shape kind of reminds me of a more compressed version of Canon's 200mm f2 lens. And so we're talking about a lens that is going to weigh in at 58 ounces or 1,645 grams. And so it's going to be heavier than, say, 70 to 200 f2.8 lenses. But Sigma is claiming that it's going to be built to professional specifications, and so it's going to get weather sealing that is up at the end of the sport line. I mean, it's got a lens hood that is this carbon fiber, you know, embedded kind of blend. And so it's going to be a pretty high-end lens here. And so I'm interested in seeing what the price comes in at, but certainly it's going to be a pretty serious competitor for Nikon's 105mm f1.4. And then of course it fills a niche that that Canon doesn't have, and this is going to be the longest lens with an f1.4 aperture available across these systems, and of course also available for Sony FE, which would be a very interesting option for those that shoot portraits there. And so this is going to be interesting. But the thing that I think is really interesting that I haven't heard anybody else really talking about, but I've seen it in these press releases, is that now on Canon, these new lenses are actually going to have support for Canon in-body corrections like distortion, chromatic aberrations, vignette. This is huge because this has been an area where Canon has had a complete lockdown on third-party lenses. And so this is one of those kind of market shifts that I'm talking about, and that it seems like maybe something has happened here, at least for Sigma, an agreement or Canon just kind of loosening up a little bit on that. But now, for the first time, you're going to be able to have in-camera corrections on Canon bodies for third-party lenses. And beyond that, Sigma has announced a firmware update for some existing Art Series lenses with the promise of more to come. That is also going to enable these in-camera profile corrections, which is huge. I mean, for one thing, there's been some compatibility type issues in the past. If you mistakenly have that lens aberration correction setting on in a Canon camera. So not only is that eliminated, but now the ability to get, JPEGs that are corrected is pretty huge. And so that's a major shift that I saw. And then finally, two other kind of interesting things that I've noted in this last release period is that there are two more premium 50mm f1.4 options that are coming for Canon EF, including a third lens in the new Samyang Rokinon XP high performance series premium lenses, actually a 50mm f1.2, which I think will probably be optically pretty fantastic. I thought that the Samyang 85mm f1.2, while not the absolute sharpest 85mm lens that I've seen, it had, I think, the best rendering of any that I've seen. So I'm very interested in that lens. And then Tokina has announced an Opera 50mm f1.4 option. This is going to be an autofocusing lens, full ring AF autofocus. It's going to be fully weather sealed. And so it sounds a lot and looks a lot like, say, the Sigma 50mm f1.4 Art, except for with weather sealing. And I'm interested in seeing what the autofocus performance is like. But if Tokina has managed to nail autofocus performance, it could be a really compelling alternative to the Sigma 50mm f1.4 Art series. The proof will be in the pudding, as they say. And so all I can say is that after all of these announcements, it looks like I'll be busy for a while. So anyway, feel free to chime in down below, on things that have struck you during this release cycle or announcement cycle, and of course input on maybe what you'd like to see me prioritize as this stuff starts to get rolled out. Also throw, where they're available, I'll throw pre-order links down into the description below, and some of you may be interested in, I think that some of these products, A7 III for example, are going to be really high demand that will probably outstrip supply initially, and so a pre-order may be a good idea if you think that one of these products is for you. So I'll throw that down there. Of course, you can always follow me there on social media, become one of my patrons, and stay tuned for a lot more exciting coverage coming in the near future. I'm Dustin Abbott. Thanks for watching today. Have a great day.